Hello everyone, welcome to the course on basic cognitive processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. In the last few lectures, we have been talking about memory. In the last lecture, we talked about what memory means, how is memory important at a cognitive function, how does memory help us get this sense of continuity of life, how does memory really act as a glue for all our sensory and sensory experiences, all the things that we are we want to retain over a period of time in our lives. We ended the last lecture talking about sensory memory, which is one of the important components of memory as proposed by Atkins and Shiffrin in their modal model of memory. In today's lecture, we will focus upon something called the short term memory, and we will try and see what short term memory is and how do we deal with short term memory. Now, short term memory is the system involved in storing small amounts of information for a brief period of time. That is how Baddeley defines it. Now, Baddeley says that short term memory is basically about two things: small amounts of information, also for small amounts of time. Why would you need these kind of small amounts of information, and how will that be useful for it? So, anything you are doing, say for example, if you are doing some arithmetic calculation mentally, you would need just the two numbers and whatever operation you are doing. This is relatively smaller information, and once you have successfully, let us say, multiplied or divided or added something, that information is not useful anymore. You just take the result and you move ahead with this. So, this is how, or say for example, let me take another example. If you are hearing somebody, or say for example, if I am talking to you or you listening to me, the beginning of the sentence which I am saying remains there for a very short time. After that, it is gisted out and you just remember the gist of the entire message. So, those are some scenarios wherein short term memory can be very useful. Short term memory is basically like the RAM of your system, wherein all the things that you are doing, all the things you are currently involved in, everything that is in the present is there in the short term memory, because you are drawing constantly from the long term memory, using that information that you have drawn from the long term memory, and after using that, performing some operation on it in the short term memory, you let it go again back to the long term memory. So, that is what the importance of short term memory is. Now, what is the duration of short term memory? So, Brown and Peterson they use the method of recall to determine what is the duration of short term memory. So, what they did was, in their experiments, participants were given a very similar task, the one I am going to demonstrate to you. So, say for example, I could tell you that I will say some letters and then I will say a number. Now, whatever letters I say, your task will be to remember the letters. When you hear the number, however, repeat it and then begin counting backwards by threes. So, from that number, say for example, if I say ABC 309, then you already start counting 309, 306, 303, 300, 297 and so on until I say recall. As I am saying recall, you have to stop counting immediately and say the three letters you have heard just before that number. So, this is something which you can do it very easily. So, if I say ABC 506, then you can kind of start talking backward, and then I say after some time recall, and you have to say which thing you did. You have to constantly keep counting, and constantly I will say some letters to you. This is the whole demonstration. So, in the first trial I could say, let us say SGL 45, trial 2 I could say something else, and you can keep counting, and there could be different digits. So, this was the overall thing. To actually administer it, if you want to do it with one of your friends, what you have to do is, it is important that the person counts out aloud. So, he is constantly counting at the top of his voice, and so that he is not rehearsing the letters. The second most important part is, once the person is started counting, you kind of take around 20 seconds and then you say recall. And then what you do is, remember, you accurately say for example, see how much information, what are the three letters the person has remembered accurately, and before he continues to the next trial. Now, Peterson also did a similar experiment in which they varied the time between they said the number and when the participant began recalling the number. So, they kind of tried to vary the time between the recall signal comes and the number is there. Now, Peterson they found that their participants were able to remember around 80% of the letters after counting for 3 seconds. So, after counting for 3 seconds, their memory is intact, they are doing very well, they are remembering around 80% of these letter sequences that have been told. But if they increase the time for which they have said recall by 15 more seconds, the participants could remember on an average of only 12% of the 3 letter groups. So, they have to constantly keep remembering all those letter groups that you have said. Now, Peterson interpreted this result as demonstrating that participants are forgetting the letters because of the decay. So, they are maintaining the letters, but the time gap you give between saying recall and between saying the first sequence of letters, as long as this time gap is increasing, the memory for those letters is decaying off, because you have to constantly maintain the letters which I am saying. You still have to do the counting, but you have to maintain the letters which I am saying. Now, this is what they say, that memory is decaying because of the passage of time after hearing the first sequence of letters. Keppel and Underwood later, at a later point in time, they actually looked more closely at the results which Peterson reported, and they found that if you consider the participants' performance very closely, and on just the first trial, there is a little fall off between the 3-second and the 18-second delay. If you are just talking about the first trial. So, for example, if I have said ABC 309. Now, ABC 309 after 3 seconds and ABC 309 after 18 seconds, there is very little fall off for this amount. Now, why should the information, why should the memory for this is getting worsened up after a few trials? Is it just time or something is happening? Now, Keppel and Underwood suggested that the drop off in memory was due to the decay of the memory trace. Peterson and Peterson had proposed it is not due to just the decay of the memory trace, but it is due to proactive interference. What is proactive interference? Proactive interference is that interference which occurs when information that was learned previously interferes with learning of new information. So, as soon as I am adding on the sequences of letters, you are kind of finding it more difficult to remember those sequences of letters. That is what is happening. Okay. So, it is not only time, but it is buildup of information that is leading to this decay and leading to this inaccuracy in performance. Here you can see the results. So, if you see the 3-second delay and the 18-second delay on all the trials, you see that the performance kind of dips off significantly. But if you are just taking the first trial in mind, you see even on the 18-second delay, the performance is not veered off very significantly. Now, Keppel and Underwood, they propose that proactive interference is what caused the decrease in memory observed in the later trials of Peterson and Peterson's experiment. Thus, recalling the early letters in the list created interference that made it more difficult to recall the later letters. You might have also seen this happening with you. Say, for example, if I give you my mobile phone number and 5 days later, 10 days later, I tell you that my mobile phone number has changed, it might actually make it difficult for you to remember which is my correct number. Nowadays, it does not really happen because you will update your cell phone with the new information. But suppose if you were to remember this information and I keep giving you new information, say for example, it is my address. So, I give you one address and I ask you to come to my home. Next time I kind of change the address and I give you another address and I expect you to remember that. What will happen is, obviously sometime you will kind of confuse which is the address I am living on. Basically, my earlier address will make it difficult for you to remember my later and more recent addresses. That is typical example of proactive interference, and there are many ways you will find this happening. Now, we have talked about the duration of short term memory. Now, let us talk about the capacity of short term memory. Now, there are certainly capacity limits on short term memory as well. The estimate ranges between around 4 to 9 items. So, there have been different kinds of estimates made, and they say that it is just around 4 to 9 items. Now, we have in the earlier class talked about short term memory has very small capacity, stores for a very small amount of time, but is it as short as 4 or 9 items only? How do you remember other information? If you really want to check somebody's short term memory capacity, what you could do is you could use this demonstration from Goldstein's book on cognitive psychology. What you just have to do is you can just write first a sequence of 3 letters, then add one more letter, ask them to recall a sequence of 4 letters, or digits, maybe you can do it. So, 3 digits, 4 digits, 5 digits, 6 digits, and you have to ask the person to repeat that digits back to you. without making any errors and doing it in a particular order. According to the measurements of digit span, the average capacity of the short term memory is somewhere around 5 to 9 items. That is basically about the length of a phone number. Now, this idea was initially proposed by George Miller in 1956, where he wrote a very significant and very important paper called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. So, you are saying the size or the capacity of the short term memory is around 7 plus minus 2 items. More recent measures of short term memory capacity, however, have set the capacity limit to be about around 4 items. This is a more recent thing found in the work of Cohen in 2001. Now, this conclusion was basically based on the results of experiments like the one done by Luck and Vogel in 1997, in which they are measuring the capacity of the short term memory by flashing 2 arrays of colored squares separated by a brief delay. And then they kind of say how many squares they correctly remember. So, I will show you this in a demonstration. Say for example, you see this array of squares, and then there is a gap and you see this other array of squares. What you have to do is you have to judge whether the second array of squares has all the same element as the first array of squares. So, participants' task here was to basically indicate whether the second array was the same or different from the first array, and on the trials in which the second row was different, second array was different, the color of one square was only changed. So, you kind of have to be really attentive and check which square has changed its color. Maybe you can do this again. So, here is the array, the short delay, here is another array. Did you recall, did you make out which color, which square's color was changed? Now, the result of this experiment showed that the performance was almost perfect till there were 1 to 3 squares in that array, but the performance gradually and steadily began to decrease when they started adding more than 4 squares. So, Luck and Vogel concluded from this result that participants were able to retain only up to about 4 items in their short term memory. Other experiments using verbal materials have also come to around the same conclusion. You can see this result of Luck and Vogel's experiment here. You see, as the number of squares is increasing from 1 to 3 to 4 to 8 to 12, the performance is steadily and significantly declining. But 4 seems too less, isn't it? As I was saying earlier as well, 4 seems too less information to be able, that we can recall, that we can retain. So, how do we store so much information even in our short term memory? Say for example, if you have to recall my phone number which has 10 digits, it is certainly 10 digits and not just 4 numbers. Okay, how do you do that? How do we say for example, if there is a long sentence we have to remember, how do we remember that long sentence? These kind of questions can be asked, and let us see in the later things how do we do it. We do it by using a particular phenomenon called chunking. So, Miller in 1956 introduced the concept of what is called chunking to describe the fact that small units like words can be combined to make larger, more meaningful units like phrases, or even larger units like sentences, paragraphs or stories. Say for example, if I give you this list of words: monkey, child, widely zoo, jumped, city, ringtail, young, these are 8 or 9 words, and if I ask you to repeat them very quickly, or let us say if I ask you to repeat them in pairs, ringtail, monkey, jumped, wildly, young, child, city, zoo, maybe this is slightly easier than the earlier disorganized array of words. If I organize it even better, the ringtail monkey jumped wildly for the young child at the zoo is better remembered as compared to the first one. So, what is it that is happening in these 3 examples? What is it that is changing? What is changing is the organization of the information into groups or chunks, and what you are doing is you are kind of remembering a chunk as a whole. So, if you see at the last sentence, it has exactly the same number of words, it has all the words that I said in the first example, but now it has a structure to it, it has an organization to it, and what you will remember is the gist of what this message was, and you can kind of reconstruct from that gist the sentence that I will ask you to repeat. If I give you 8 or 9 separate and unorganized words in the first level, you found it difficult to repeat. So, that is pretty much what we are doing. Let me also do we'll do some simple demonstration here. Say for example, try and recall these letters. There is a gap. Could you recall everyone? Or say for example, now you try and recall this letter. Which one was easier? I have seen in class demonstrations, and I hope with you as well, that this congregation of letters is easier to remember because these are names or abbreviations. So, you can actually organize them into CIA, FBI, NBC and CBS. So, there are only 4 chunks if you organize them accordingly, and that is what chunking is all about. So, let me define chunking for you slightly in a more formal way. So, chunking has been defined as a collection of elements that are strongly associated with one another, but are weakly associated with other elements in chunks, with elements in the other chunks. So, you can have units working together and distinctive or distinguishable from other units. So, you can have ringtail monkey, but if you have a ringtail child, that will not make the association very well. So, if there is ringtail monkey coming together, you will remember it much better. Erickson and colleagues demonstrated an effect of chunking by showing how a college student with average memory ability was able to achieve amazing feats of memory. So, they trained this kid, their participant was named SF, and he had a typical memory span like all of us of 7 digits. But he received extensive training for about 230 1-hour sessions, and then he was able to repeat sequences up to 79 digits without making an error. How was SF doing that? Obviously, SF was using chunking to recode the digits into larger units and formed slightly meaningful sequences. Say for example, 3492 became 2 minutes and 49.2 seconds or 3 minutes and 49.2 seconds. Now, this is a way, if you kind of remember this kind of can become a way or a cue to remember this information in a more meaningful way, and in that sense this can be basically used to enhance your memory. So, a very simple tip will be for people who want to improve their memory, having done a course on cognitive psychology and read something about memory, is to start organizing information better, start storing information in ways that are meaningful to you, and so that those meaningful ways can be cued with very little effort. Now, coming back, another similar example is based on the interaction between the short term memory and the long term memory, and it was provided by an experiment done by Chase and Simon in 1973. Wherein what they did was they showed chess players arrangements of chess pieces taken from actual games for 5 seconds. So, chess players and a novice person who had never played chess, they were shown arrangements of 24 pieces or 24 chess pieces on a particular board, and then they were later asked to recall which were the pieces. So, the chess players basically were asked to reproduce their positions, the position that they had seen, and it was like the chess and Chase and Simon compared this performance of a chess master who had played or studied chess for around 10,000 hours to this performance of a beginner who had around less than 100 hours of experience. Now, the results of this particular experiment showed that the chess master had placed 16 pieces out of 24 pieces correctly on his first try itself, compared to 4 out of 24 pieces that the beginner person could do. Also, the master required only 4 trials to reproduce all of the 24 pieces correctly, as compared to the beginner who could not even do the same even after 7 trials. So, you see, there is something here. Now, is it that the chess player is an expert? So, here is the data. So, the master around does this correct placement, 16 correct placements on the first trial itself, beginner does only 4. So, does the master have better short term memory than the beginner? Or does he have better knowledge of chess? Is that helping him in some way or the other? That was the question that was asked. Simon and Chase they answered this question by testing the ability of the masters and the beginners to remember random arrangement of chess pieces. So, if you have played chess, if you are familiar with chess, if you have arranged something in a particular way, you will know that there are specific positions and there is a specific name for each position. So, if you are a chess master, you can recall those positions by experience and you can say that. But when you are actually looking at randomly arranged pieces, there is no name for those kind of positions, and then let us see what happened. When the pieces were arranged randomly, the familiar patterns were destroyed and the chess master's advantage completely vanished. So, it was not that his short term memory was better, it was that he knew those familiar positions from obviously a lot of practice and skill that is acquired over 10,000 hours of chess training, and that was what was helping him organize those positions better. There were names of those positions and that he could have used to organize that. So, you see here there is no advantage for the master if he cannot chunk on the basis of previous knowledge. That is pretty much what we all do if we are fed in new information. Now, how do you feed in new information in short term memory? That is the third question one can ask. You feed in new information into the short term memory by a process called coding or a process called encoding. Now, determining how a stimulus is represented in the brain by firing of specific neurons, as was seen by Ubel and Wiesel, as I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, is called the physiological approach to coding. That is one way to do it. The other way to do it is following the mental approach to coding. What is the mental approach to coding? The mental approach to coding is by asking how a stimulus or an experience is represented in the mind. Say for example, if you go somewhere and you meet some new person and you just have a short conversation with him, you come back and you are trying to recall that person. Maybe there is something salient about that person. Maybe that he belonged to a city where you had done your previous schooling. If you remember that person according to that knowledge, it might help you recall better. Now, similar things you could use in chunking as well. So, there could be a variety of ways in which one can encode information. The first kind of way is auditory encoding. Auditory encoding involves representing items in the short term memory based on their sound. So, what Conrad did in his 1964 experiment, he showed participants a number of target letters which flashed very briefly on a screen, and then the participants were told to write down the letters in the exact order they were present. Now, Conrad found that when participants made errors, they did make some errors, though when participants made errors, they were most likely to misidentify the target letters as another letter if they sounded very similar. So, if they sounded very similar, there was a scope of confusing them. Say for example, a lot of participants were misidentified F as S because they sound so similar to each other. Conrad concluded on the basis of these results that the code for STM is the preferred encoding method for STM or short term memory is auditory rather than visual. Now, it is not that we do not encode visual information, or it is not that we do not encode information in a visual manner. We also do encode items and information in a visual manner, and visual encoding basically involves representing items visually, as say for example would occur if you are trying to remember the details of a floor plan or a blueprint of a particular building, something like that, or the layout of a streets on a map. If you are dealing with specifically visual information that is not really easily encoded in the verbal thing, you will use it visually as well. Now, this use of visual codes in the short term memory was demonstrated in an experiment by Sergio Della Sala and their colleagues in 1999, in which participants were presented a task like this one here. So, I will show you this array of squares, some of them are blacked, and then I will ask you to fill exactly which squares are blacked in this particular experiment. Now, both of these demonstrations are drawn from Goldstein's book Cognitive Psychology. Now, Della Sala in this experiment found that participants were able to complete patterns consisting of an average of around 9 shaded squares before they started making mistakes. So, up till 9 squares they could correctly remember, but they started making mistakes if the number of squares was more than 9. Another way of coding information other than auditory and other than visual is basically starting to code information on the basis of semantics, on the basis of their meaning and their relationship to whatever knowledge you already have, something that I was telling. Now, semantic coding is representing items in terms of their meaning. An example of semantic coding in STM is provided in an experiment done by Wickens and colleagues, and in this experiment what happened was that on each trial participants were presented with words related to either a fruit or a profession. So, there were two groups, they were presented items names of fruits, and the other group was presented names of professions. So participants in each group, they were listening to 3 words, for example banana, peach and apple, and then started counting backwards for 15 seconds and then attempted to recall all the 3 words. Now they did this for a total of 4 trials and with different words presented on each trial. So every trial they will say, for example, see some names of fruits, then they will start counting backwards and they will be told another 3 fruits and they will start counting and they will continue counting backwards, but they have to remember all of this. Now the basic idea behind this experiment was to create what is called proactive interference by presenting words in a series of trials from the same category. So if you are repeating the same kind of words trial by trial, these new trials will actually interfere with the older trials. I will show you a demonstration. Say for example, you can see in trial in the fruits group, the first trial is banana, peach and apple, the second trial is plum, apricot and lime, the third trial is melon, lemon and grape, the fourth trial is orange, cherry and pineapple. So the fruits group is basically getting all of these fruit names. The second group is the professions group and they are also being said these profession names only on the 4th trial. They are not told a profession's name, they are actually told a fruit's name, 3 names of fruit. So first trial is lawyer, firefighter, teacher, second is dancer, minister, executive, grocer, doctor, editor. The fourth one is the name of 3 fruits. Now what do you think happened here? Now it was found that for the fruits group, on the first trial, the average percentage recall was as high as 86%, but performance dropped gradually and steadily on trials 2, 3 and 4 as additional names of fruits were being presented. Now this additional information forms the part of the same category of the first trial, and in that sense there is proactive interference starting from the second trial, third trial and the fourth trial. The blue data points I will show you now indicate that the presence of proactive interference is there. If you see in this figure here. On the fourth, on the professional group, what happened was that because the fourth trial had names of fruits instead of professions, there is no proactive interference, there is what is called release from proactive interference. That is why the performance of recall on the fourth trial is also very good. So you can see here in this particular result that in the fruits group you will see that the performance is steadily and gradually declining from trial 1 to trial 2, 3 and 4. In the professions group you will see that the performance is very good on the first trial, it comes down on the second trial, goes further down on the third trial, but on the fourth trial there is already a release, the participants performance already kicks up, and this is and why is this happening is because the things presented, the names presented on the fourth trial were different from all the names presented in trials 1, 2 and 3. So this phenomena is basically referred to as release from proactive interference. Because the fourth trial had names from a different category, participants had no trouble in recalling this new information and their performance increased and it became better. Now these were some aspects about short term memory that we studied today. We talked about the duration of short term memory, we talked about capacity of short term memory, and we also talked about different ways in which information can be encoded into short term memory. I hope this session on short term memory would help you understand more about memory as a mental function. In the next chapter we will talk about other aspects of memory that were proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin. Thank you so much.